Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board College Football Podcast. I think it's week 12 at last check, the second unveiling of the college football playoff rankings, and still plenty of questions to be answered by teams that have aspirations of achieving college football immortality. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts on this very fine program, Payne Insider and Brad Powers. And gentlemen, I commend the both of you for making an executive decision early in the season. We were supposed to have a Bet the Board field trip last weekend, and I'm glad that we decided not to make the pilgrimage to one of college football's meccas in the shadow of Touchdown Jesus.
I mean, it would have been a little bit enjoyable for me outside of the cold, but for the entirety of the group, wouldn't have been an enjoyable experience.
No, not at all. I mean, I think I watched about 12 snaps, and I was like, yep, I'm done. So I don't know what I would have done had I been there.
Well, that's the worst part, is that there's not a whole lot of watering holes in South Bend, so you can't really leave the game at halftime and try and find, better scenery around there. We'd have to jump in the car and drive all the way back to Chicago to catch the final score for the way the second half went.
We would have sat on the Florida State side, and thankfully you guys would have been there, because there would have been some things spewed in the direction of that coaching staff. Oof.
You'd have been like the guy from the viral video from a couple weeks ago, the North Carolina game. That would have been you.
Not me. Not me.
By the way, Payne, speaking of that coaching staff, we saw major changes come down this week.
Yep. Had to.
Is that the beginning, or is that
Yeah, there's a couple other guys coming. I don't really
right.
want to speak on people getting fired, but yeah, there's
I don't
more
want to see you don't want to see anybody lose their job. We never root for that kind of thing.
A couple of those guys certainly deserve it, but
I didn't say that he didn't deserve it. You just said you don't want to see it happen.
Appreciate Ron Dugan's delivering a couple national titles there alongside Peter Warwick, but not good, Bob. Not good. When Keon Coleman's telling recruits, hey, don't come here, there was a problem there brewing ahead of this season. So now it becomes the interesting task of finding some assistant coaches, and I think that becomes a little bit more of a difficult task. Obviously, Mike is locked up with the new contract. I think he'll get 2 more years, but you will certainly be negatively recruited, and there will be coaches that think, hey, it's one and done. Am I going to leave my job at this position in a P4 situation for that? And it'll become difficult. I think the rumors are maybe swirling that hopefully there's an Arkansas coach that underperforms here down the stretch and gets canned, and that would be your offensive line coach. So we'll see how some things unfold in the coming weeks here for Florida State.
And as far as Notre Dame on the flip side, we will get to them next week in greater detail when they take on an undefeated Army team, no doubt one of our big game breakdowns. But better things ahead for the Irish as they continue to make their push towards inclusion in the college football playoff. But gentlemen, one team that would love to be able to continue to win out and be conference champions in their first foray through the SEC would, of course, be the Texas Longhorns. And Texas goes on the road to Fayetteville this weekend as right around a 2-touchdown favorite, 13.5. There are some 13s for their trip to take on Arkansas. Total on the game at 57.5. Texas and Arkansas meeting as conference opponents for the first time since 1991. Both schools were members of the Southwest Conference from 1915 to 1991 and met in 60 straight seasons during that span. Arkansas idle last week, a chance to heal up for players like Taylon Green and Jaquindon Jackson on the offensive side. But for Arkansas, they're playing their 5th game versus a ranked opponent in the span of 6 games. They've gone 1-4 during that stretch, losing back-to-back games versus those ranked teams by 24-plus points. They do have the big win as it right around a 2-touchdown underdog on their resume earlier this year when they upset Tennessee. Meanwhile, for Texas on the flip side, this is a program that started 8-1 or better in back-to-back seasons for the first time since 2008-2009. Their 7 wins by 19-plus points this season is tied for the most in the FBS alongside Oregon. One of 3 remaining SEC teams with just 1 conference loss include Tennessee and Texas A&M in that bucket. And this is a Texas team who made very quick work of Florida last week, 49-17 against the Gators, led 35-0 at the half. It was the largest halftime lead for UT going all the way back to 2021 when they took on Rice, marking their 5th game of the season with 500-plus yards of total offense. Brad, Arkansas offensively, I mean, this is a group that's top 5 in total offense, averaging nearly 485 yards per game. They've had 3 games with 600-plus total yards. Talon Green, those of us out here on the West Coast watching him at Boise State, and I think inconsistency was probably the best word to describe his skill set. But you look at the weapons he's surrounded by at Arkansas, running Bobby Petrino's scheme. We've seen flashes of brilliance. We've seen him nicked up and as a reluctant runner, but this arguably one of his biggest tests against a Texas defense that by the counting stats answers the bell a number of times. But do we see a potential path for Arkansas moving the football maybe on the ground against a Texas team that hasn't been airtight against opposing ground and pound attacks?
Yeah, obviously, basic counting stats are going to say edge to Texas here. The question is, how big of that is that edge? And that's where I begin to question a little bit. So I'm more on that slight edge to Texas here. Obviously, look at Arkansas's offense. By Petrino, I think I wouldn't necessarily say 2 thumbs up, but I would give him a thumbs up so far. I mean, number 11 in yards per play, number 6 in offensive success rate, number 5 total offense. There has certainly been some inconsistency. You mentioned the 3 games of nearly 650 yards or more, and then you have obviously the LSU game against not so great LSU defense, and they couldn't do anything in that game. A lot of it rests on the shoulders of the quarterback and his inconsistency. And Talon Green, who's number 48th in the country in QBR, never is going to be the thought of as a great passer. But you thought that, his running ability would be able to open up maybe the passing game a little bit more than it has. He certainly has found a go-to wide receiver in Andrew Armstrong, who has nearly 1,000 yards receiving already, double the receptions of the number 2 guy. He's their highest graded player on offense. But I think also some of the inconsistency for Arkansas has been, hey, guys just, in the last month haven't been necessarily healthy, starting with Talon Green, who even missed the second half of the Ole Miss game with a sprained knee. Word is he should be good to go here. You got Jaquindon Jackson, who we talked about on an earlier podcast a few weeks ago, who I thought, at least from the early part of the season, was maybe one of the more underrated transfer portal gets in the country. 10 rushing touchdowns, despite the fact he's missed the last 2 games with an ankle. I'm a little bit more confident in Talon Green, being 100% and getting out there. Jackson, I would say, is probably a little bit more. I don't want to use the word questionable. I think he'll play, but let's see if he's close to 100%. Getting the bye week probably came at the right time. Certainly, it always comes at the right time if you listen to any coach. But in Arkansas's case, as far as injuries, it certainly did. I think a big question here is, can their offensive line protect? I mean, against Texas A&M and Tennessee, 2 really good defensive fronts, they did a decent job. It's not like they were locked down and gave up 0 sacks, but they did enough to allow their offense to move enough to win either game. They didn't win the A&M game, even though they should, and won the box score, and obviously they did end up pulling the outright upset against Tennessee. The Ole Miss game, though, against that defensive front, wasn't a good look. 8 sacks, and obviously right out of the gate, I mean, they're giving up, that sack and score that opened the floodgates as far as the scoring for that. Texas defense, you mentioned it, number 1 in yards per play, number 2 in yards per game, number 4 in scoring. I mean, I could talk about a lot of their, the players, Anthony Hill at linebacker, the Simmons kid off the edge. I like a couple of their guys in the secondary. And speaking of the secondary, they're number 1 passing defense in the country, number 2 in EPA per dropback. But I think the major takeaway from Texas is, who have they played? I mean, here we are in mid-November. I mean, obviously Michigan's offense leaves a lot to be desired, to say the least. Same thing with Oklahoma. Same thing, facing a third string, walk-on quarterback in Florida last week. So, I mean, no question, Georgia's by far the best offense they faced. And let's be real. Georgia's not anywhere near what they've been offensively the last few years. So I got to question the opposing slate of offenses, and you can make a case that, if not the second best, maybe even if they're firing on all cylinders and Green is consistent and they are healthy, this is certainly one of the best offenses they face. So slight edge to Texas, but I don't think it's a major one. And I think there's opportunities here for Arkansas to have some success.
To kind of echo your sentiments, Brad, watch Texas a good amount so far in conference play, and I'm not blown away by anything that I see defensively. Whereas last year you watched this group, and we knew they had struggles in their secondary, but you could see the NFL caliber talent they had along that defensive front and knew those guys were disruptors. Now, maybe it's they'll get last laugh. Texas, of course, controls their own destiny in the SEC and for bigger prizes on the horizon. But to your point, I mean, this could be a little bit of a jolt to the system for them in Fayetteville against an Arkansas team that has 2 weeks to prepare things, and you figure there are going to be some wrinkles that they haven't shown on tape already if they're healthy. Now, on the other side, Payne, Texas clearly should have a path to success against this Arkansas defense. I mean, Steve Sarkisian says he feels confident in his team's mindset and their preparation. He talked about the program's last trip to Fayetteville and how things didn't exactly go the way they drew it up back in 2021. We know about the prolific passing attack. They're getting healthier at the receiving position with Isaiah Bond and Matthew Golden flashing. And this is an Arkansas defense who's now had 2 weeks to stew over, giving up 63 points to Ole Miss, the second most points allowed in a home game in the last 50 seasons for the program. And it was as simple as pitch and catch, like a turkey bowl where your 26-year-old uncle is torching a 6-year-old out there in the defensive backfield. Can Arkansas do anything to try and atone for what they weren't able to, taking away the explosive against Ole Miss that connected on a number of 50-plus yard touchdown passes?
Probably not. One thing that
was a quick handicap. All right, over the total it is for me.
Seems pretty clear at this point in the season. We touched on it a few weeks back when LSU visited Arkansas. When the Hogs step up in class and face an offense that can protect its quarterback and is efficient throwing, it's really difficult for Arkansas's defense to compete, and that's the equation we have with Texas this week. The Longhorns have only allowed Quinn Ewers to be pressured on 26% of dropbacks this season. If you remove the Georgia data point where Kirby throws the curveball and blitzes and stunts and had a far more aggressive front than we've ever seen, you look at Ewers' pressure rate, it's less than 25% of his snaps this season. Ewers actually does a really good job getting the ball out on time. Texas has the number one graded offensive line in pass protection on the season. Florida only got to Ewers on 13% of his dropbacks last week. And Arkansas's defensive line has struggled to get pressure all season. It's basically Landon Jackson and then what? And even Landon Jackson, only an 11% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, 32 pressures in total. The next closest guys are Nico and Gregory with 14 pressures each. So Landon Jackson hasn't been a guy that you need to double, but if you choose to, there's really not another option that can get pressure consistently on the quarterback, and that lack of pressure is really exposed a weak Arkansas secondary. I know I praised defensive coordinator Travis Williams for throwing a monster curveball at Josh Heupel in Tennessee's offense, and it's pretty crystal clear now that the Vols' pass game is a little broken. And so that maybe feels more like Vols' ineptitude than Travis Williams' brilliance. But that was a good week for Travis Williams, coming up with that game plan, signing a blue chip linebacker over some of the big boys. We'll see if he can hold on to them. But I look at Arkansas, bottom 10 in the country in schedule adjusted passing success rate allowed, outside the top 100 in EPA per pass allowed. You mentioned Isaiah Bond being back healthy. The Longhorns really have an explosive pass attack, fringe top 10 in the country. Quinn Ewers, if you watch him, he is at his best when the offense is rhythmic. And I think there's some real potential for that in this matchup with Ole Miss not wanting to get beat deep. So maybe they play their corners off a little bit and allows Quinn to get in a rhythm early. Now, Arkansas was embarrassed by Ole Miss. They've had the bye week. they're saying all of the right things about the last 2 weeks being a camp-like open competition for playing time in the secondary. Let's see if that helps, but certainly a massive advantage for Texas's offense here.
Such an interesting game. Like Brad, you kind of alluded to, comes at the right time for the Razorbacks, but can they fix what ailed them in that Ole Miss game against the Texas team? Looking to continue to try and play downhill and solidify their standing in the SEC as they try to get to the conference championship game. From the SEC, gents, to the Big 12 and the muddled mess that is this conference from arguably top to bottom, it's Baylor, fresh off a bye in their own rights, going on the road to Morgantown to take on West Virginia. And it's the Baylor Bears, a 2.5-point road favorite here, painted across the board. Total in this game, 59 on the low end, upwards of 60. Baylor, across their last 3 games, the offense has really taken off, totaling nearly 1,600 yards and 134 points. Sawyer Robertson's play at quarterback has been towards the top of the conference since he took over as the starter. And one of the main reasons that we've seen this Bears offense really on the ascent has coincided with their ability to run the football. West Virginia, meanwhile, thankfully for us and our listeners, got the outright win last week against Cincinnati, despite numbers that may not have suggested they should have won that game outright with 9 first downs and 248 total yards of offense. The big storyline to follow is around the starting quarterback for West Virginia this week. Garrett Green, a full participant in practice on Tuesday as he tries to recover from a concussion. We'll see if he's out there under center. Brad, offensively, though, for Baylor, Jake Spavital has taken a little while, but his fingerprint's now all over this group, and it's paid dividends. I mean, we kind of wrote Baylor off for dead early in the season when they dug themselves a massive hole, showed fight against BYU, and they've kind of used some of that momentum to keep going forward. Sawyer Robertson, the Mississippi State transfer, has looked the part as facilitator, runner, passer, doing all the things that they're looking for. But one of the main reasons that Baylor has said they've had a lot of success, they've credited the emergence of Bryson Washington kind of as their bell cow back and an offensive line that's going to be asked to go out there and do its part against a disruptive defensive front for West Virginia. In steps a Mountaineers team whose front 7 above average. The secondary, well, a lot of questions to answer. Baylor's offense and their balanced approach against West Virginia, trying to get one of these coveted home wins as a short home underdog, something they failed to do in losses against Iowa State and Kansas State earlier this season.
Yeah, I think it's certainly the edge to Baylor's offense here. Trend line certainly there. I mean, full season counting stats aren't overly impressive for Baylor. 44th in total offense, 46th in offensive success rate. But you mentioned in the last 3 games, all 3 wins. What's really gotten going for them is the run game. 255 yards, 7.7 yards per carry against Texas Tech, 343 against a bad Oklahoma State defense, but still averaging 9 yards per carry, and then 257 against TCU. So getting the run game going, led by what you mentioned, Bryson Washington's really helped. And I think Sawyer Robertson has obviously given their pass attack some consistency that they didn't have with DeQuan Finn at the start of the season. He's only thrown 4 interceptions. He's number 6 in QBR, not a perfect stat, but still very noticeable to have him way up there in all of college football. He's certainly more mobile than you think, and I think catches some defenses off guard. They don't have like a go-to guy at wide receiver. They got 4 guys with 20+ receptions. The guy that certainly jumps out on film to you is Josh Cameron, their leader there. You mentioned the offensive line that has been solidified after a very disappointing season a year ago. They've allowed just 12 sacks. So right now, I mean, you mentioned it. I mean, at halftime of the BYU game, they were getting crushed. I mean, I had this coaching staff dead and buried, thought they were going to get fired, and they had a more competitive than final score against Iowa State, and then 3 straight wins. So, liking what I'm seeing from Baylor's offense. West Virginia defensively, kudos for them for getting those 2 defensive touchdowns. Really needed them last week. Thank you, appreciate that. But my goodness, I don't see it. 107th in yards per play. They've been decent versus the run, but mainly I think that's more because they've been so susceptible to the pass. Number 130 in the country in coverage grade, number 106 in EPA per dropback, 119 in defensive success rate versus the pass. I just think To me, it comes down to this. Baylor protects the quarterback pretty well. West Virginia wants to be able to get after the quarterback without bringing pressure to save that secondary a little bit. Can TJ Jackson, can a Bradley at the edge, without having to send multiple blitzers, can they get by themselves some pass rush? If they can't, then Baylor's certainly going to have their way here. So I think because maybe last week's given, if you're just scoreboard watching, you're thinking, big thumbs up for West Virginia. Not so much for me. I have some big time concerns here.
No, I'm right there with you. Brandon Sorsby doesn't lose his mind with Cincinnati already up 7-0. They have a chance to kind of put the screws to West Virginia and put them in a very difficult spot. Fortunately, West Virginia, as you mentioned, gets those big defensive scores and changes the dynamic of the game. Offensively, Payne for West Virginia, as we alluded to, the offensive effort wasn't pretty. Garrett Green, a full participant in practice on Tuesday. Neil Brown has kind of said that the quarterback situation will be a true game time decision with Nico and Garrett Green fighting for those first team reps to be decided on Friday. Green hadn't done much in terms of football activity since leaving the Kansas State game, so it's all about how he responds to some of that physical exertion. Marchiol had, a couple of nice throws in the win against Cincinnati. He was very good, relatively speaking, against Arizona when he went 18 for 22. But I think the most troubling thing when you watch West Virginia last week against Cincinnati, they weren't able to run the football. And in steps a Baylor's defense that while they have to prepare for two different quarterback options, Dave Aranda and company, 2 weeks to prepare, take away the run, try and make West Virginia one-dimensional, and show they can beat you throwing the football, something that may be a little bit more difficult if they don't have their full complement of weapons as we await the injury designation for Hudson Clement, the team's second leading wide receiver, who missed last week with a hamstring injury.
I think you guys hit it perfectly in that, West Virginia won outright last week, did lead 24-7 with the ball late third quarter before Nico threw a pick in the end zone going for the kill shot. And so you feel good about that. And boy, that game had so many different swings back and forth. Yeah. But the game on the field was certainly far closer than that score late in the third quarter. All told, Cincinnati was a net positive 14% in success rate, net positive 0.25 EPA per play, which matters, right? I mean, a lot of times when you get into the yard differential, and say, hey, this team, outgained the other team by 200 yards. It's certainly, telling, but also, when you turn the ball over like that, the offense gets the ball right back and the other team's offense does not. So when you look at the down-to-down stuff, it was glaring. I'm interested to see who's under center for Neil Brown. Nico has been the guy the past few games as Garrett Green dealt with a concussion. Some speculation, though, that there was injury, yes, a little bit of a benching as well. Green was available last week.
The proverbial mental reset for a quarterback who hadn't quite diagnosed defenses correctly.
Yeah. So he did practice Monday. We'll see how that goes. We'll see what comes of the quarterback situation, whichever quarterback it is for West Virginia. You have to be able to attack Baylor's defense through the air. Baylor has been really solid up front when it comes to defensive line yards allowed, rushing success rate allowed, but they're gettable through the air. And if it's Nico, I talked to Brad about this last week a little bit ahead of the game. He struggles off script a little bit, and he struggles when there isn't a run pass element and he's asked to throw in known passing situations. Garrett Green to this point hasn't been the same quarterback he was in 2023 when he lived off the explosive. It makes sense that would regress some, but I thought we all hoped in the offseason the other parts of Green's game would improve. But he come out this year struggling going through progressions again. Struggled with throwing on time, struggled with throwing with anticipation, making the right reads, not just as a passer, but even in the read option zone run game. From a clean pocket this season, Green has more turnover-worthy plays than big-time throws. That's really when you have to eat, right? When the pocket's clean and you get a perfect picture, Green just hasn't been able to do that. Maybe that changes with the mental reset, as you call it there, Todd. But I think Baylor can do enough up front to make West Virginia one-dimensional. And if Nico or Garrett Green can consistently do enough to beat you through the air on passing downs, you kind of tip your cap and move on. You mentioned it. We'll have to keep our eyes on West Virginia's second leading receiver, Hudson Clement. He's dealing with a hamstring injury, did not play last week, worked off to the side the last 2 days at practice. We know hamstrings are a bit finicky, so if he's unable to go, that certainly hinders West Virginia's ability to attack Baylor where they're most vulnerable.
Interesting game. Two teams that clearly want to try and make sure that they can finish with a flourish. West Virginia's case would need an awful lot of help, as most of these teams would in the Big 12, to be relevant in terms of a title race. But a fascinating matchup, especially given the hot seat that these two coaches were on earlier in the year. Every win goes a long way. Baylor will have 3 cracks to get bowl eligible, but nothing of formality, with a road game at Houston and a date against Kansas to close things out. From Big 12 country to the AAC, and this one goes a long way in determining the teams that we are going to see in the conference championship game, one of which hoping for a little bit of chaos in the Mountain West so they can punch their ticket to the college football playoff as the G5 representative. And that would be Tulane as a full touchdown favorite at Navy Marine Corps Stadium on Saturday with an early kickoff at noon Eastern. Total on the game at 54 for their trip to Annapolis. Tulane, they've won 16 straight conference games, kind of providing the gold standard there. A seamless transition, at least thus far, from Willie Fritz, who took his talents to Houston, and John Sumrall, who stepped up in class coming over from Troy. One shy of tying the American Athletic Conference record. It's 17 games, a record jointly held by 2 different versions of the Cincinnati Bearcats in 2017-19 and 2020 to 2022. Tulane, though, they've lost 6 of the last 7 meetings versus Navy. They haven't won in Annapolis since 2001. As far as Tulane, I mean, pretty impressive when we look at John Sumrall, and I think all 3 of us are of the mindset that he's going to be coaching at a Power 5 conference sooner rather than later. During his coaching career, Sumrall still hasn't lost a game played in October, November, and December, dating all the way back to the start of his Troy career in 2022. Speaks to his teams getting better as the season progresses. Tulane's only losses this year coming at the hands of Oklahoma and Kansas State. As far as Navy, Saturday marks senior day for the midshipmen, as well as the 300th Navy football game played at Navy Marine Corps Memorial Stadium. Navy has 23 seniors. What's most impressive about all that? The mids, 19-1 the last 20 senior days. So clearly there's a little bit of magic in the air for this program and how much it means to a lot of these guys that won't be playing football at the next level. Brad, Navy offensively this year, 321 points through 9 games. That's 109 more than it scored in its combined 12 games last year, a grand total of 212. They've scored a touchdown on the first play of a drive 5 times already this season, which is the 3rd most in the FBS. Blake Horvath, we've talked about not maybe being 100%, dealing with a little bit of a thumb injury. Wasn't on full display last week. They scored early, got out to a comfortable lead, and were able to put USF's defense on its heels with a bevy of running backs they have at their disposal. Meanwhile, on the other side for Tulane, defensively, this is a group that hasn't really been challenged in the AAC since their non-conference game. Coach Sumrall does have a little bit of familiarity. Troy played Army each of the last 2 years, but he was pretty pronounced in his statements at his press conference saying what Navy does shouldn't be misconstrued as looking the same as the Black Knights. Navy offensively against Tulane's defense. How do you see things unfolding on this side of the ball?
Yeah, current form, I'm going to give the slight edge to Tulane's defense here. Let's start with Navy's offense. Obviously, significantly improved from a year ago in the top 25 in yards per play, top 20 in scoring. Certainly, you mentioned it, got the run game going again last week with over 300 yards. I mean, the worry was the prior 3 games, they had their 3 worst performances of the season. I know they put 50 on the board on Charlotte, but that was so turnover dependent on that game. They're +5 in turnovers, scored a couple of defensive touchdowns. Horvath's obviously the captain of the ship, pun intended there. 870 yards rushing, 13 touchdowns. Really, what separated this Navy team, at least at the start of the season, and teams just weren't handling it, is the passing game. I mean, Horvath, number 8 in QBR, and first 5 games of the season, Navy is averaging 170 yards per game passing. Now, once you get put a lot of that stuff on tape, and Drew Kroenig, their new offensive coordinator, very unique, different formations and whatnot. But, tape doesn't lie, and once defensive coordinators kind of got that on tape, the passing game hasn't been as good the last 4. Now, is that tape, or like you mentioned, Todd, is it, that thumb injury that Horvat suffered? I think it was, hear me out on this. How about a Service Academy injury that was kept under wraps? Apparently he injured it in the Charlotte game. No mention of it that any mention leading up to the Notre Dame game. He's got it, taped up on that on the throwing hand on his thumb. And boy, the last 4 games, only 96 yards per game passing. The 2 losses against Notre Dame and Rice, 0 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. In the wins this season, 11-1 ratio. So, believe it or not, as Navy's passing game goes, so does, the success of their offense, something you never hear you'd say. But obviously they got a variety of weapons. The Heidenreich kid, whether it's running or receiving, is as good as what they've had there. In recent memory, I mean, he's going to set the all-time record as far as single season receiving, 556 yards receiving for him this season. Teska's played multiple years, been the starting fullback. So there's, when healthy, lot to like. However, a Tulane defense that, maybe not dominant stats like we saw from Troy's defense the last couple of years that was coached by Summerall, but certainly good enough to be, in my opinion, the best team in the American. Number 12th in the country in defensive success rate, 15th in total D. Had really one bad game this year. They've been consistent. North Texas, crushed them through the air with nearly 450 yards. But other than that, they've been buttoned up. I think you really mentioned it. I always look when you got these types of new coaches and in new spots. Well, what's your experience level facing the option? I get it. Navy's running different stuff compared to Army, but still, there's still some option principles. And the fact of the matter is, Troy against Army the last 2 years defended Army as well as anybody that Army faced the last couple of years. 0 points, 9 points. The last 2 years with that Troy defense. And another thing I like about Tulane's defense is they got experienced guys that have played 3-4 years of starting experience. They've seen it all, whether it's, Tyler Grubbs, at linebacker, Patrick Jenkins on that defensive front, the Huntington kid from ULM. They've seen a lot of option football. I just think this Tulane team, as long as they're buttoned up, now they haven't been great tackling in space. As long as, they're not having major issues there, I give them a slight edge.
Payne, Tulane offensively. Early on in the year, it felt like we were exposed to Tulane in one capacity or another from a best bet perspective, or bets that we were making on our own. And the one thing that continued to stand out was Darian Mensah, the starting quarterback for Tulane, and the level of confidence that this entire coaching staff put into this young player. Tulane, fresh off a 52-6 win over Temple, 3rd straight conference game, Tulane scored at least 30 points. Racked up 667 yards, 327 of those on the ground. And there's no surprise to anybody. Tulane boasts the top-rated offense in the AAC, a group that's produced 54 total touchdowns so far this season, averaging an impressive 41 points per game. Of those 54 touchdowns, 28 of them have come on the ground. And their ground attack has kind of been what they've leaned into, with a very talented running back in Mekhi Hughes, 5 straight 100-yard rushing games and a total of 7 so far this season on his resume. But they're not lean at the receiver position. When you get a transfer from an Oklahoma and USC and Mario Williams that steps down in class, we've seen that he just looks different getting off of the bus. Tulane, from an offensive standpoint, against a Navy defense that's outside the top 100 in a lot of key underlying running defense metrics, they've been better against the pass, but can Tulane just bully them at the point of contact and open some things up in the passing game if Navy has to commit additional resources to stopping the run?
You mentioned the schedule, and really the one game Navy's played against an offense in the same ballpark as Tulane is Notre Dame, and they had real success. Now, I don't think Navy will have to sell out to stop the run nearly as much against Tulane as they did Jeremiah Love and Notre Dame, but Tulane should be able to have balance against Navy defense outside our top 90 and both success and EPA per rush allowed. Mekhi Hughes has been fantastic for Tulane, over 4.1 yards per rush before first contact. He's forcing a missed tackle on over 22% of runs, 16% explosive run rate. So he has been absolutely dynamic for Tulane. The game's going to be on Mensa as well. And Tulane hasn't been as good in the trenches, I don't think, relative to the Willie Fritz era, but the passing attack for Tulane, I think, has been better. When I look at this top 25 and down-to-down passing success rate, Mensa's hitting the explosive, so it's a top 5 offense in schedule-adjusted EPA per pass, and that has been the Achilles heel of Navy. Metrically, I think, to your point, it doesn't look terrible for Navy's pass defense, just barely outside the top 50. But Memphis is really the only passing offense on the schedule that was worth respecting to a certain degree. Notre Dame at that point heading into the game was ice cold through the air, and Riley Leonard went 7 for 10 on throws, 10-plus yards for two touchdowns. Notre Dame receivers were just running free all day. The blue chip Oklahoma and USC receiver you mentioned, Mario Williams, has been that big play threat for Tulane this season, nearly 3.5 yards per route run. Dante Fleming has been a nice complementary piece, 2.5 yards per route run. Tulane does a really good job spreading the ball around, so it's difficult to kind of key in on a guy. You mentioned last night to me, Todd, that John Summerall was having some concerns potentially about Mensa handling Navy's blitz packages. It was a good call out, so I dug into it a little bit. Navy went basically like kamikaze mode and sent heat at Riley Leonard on 55% of his dropbacks in the Notre Dame game, only generated a 27% pressure rate. So when I look at Mensa, yes, he's got a 4.5% turnover-worthy play rate against the blitz, but when he's protecting the football, he's been absolutely dynamic in that regard. He's attacking the attacker, something we're always looking for. 12.5-yard ADOT when blitzed, 130 passer rating when under pressure with an 80% adjusted accuracy. That's 9th best among 147 qualifying quarterbacks in college football. So if Navy elects to send pressure, Mensa has proven he wants to be aggressive and attack it, and through at least a 10-game sample size, Mensa's been elite making defenses pay when they try to manufacture pressure.
BP, final word to you on this game. As far as evaluating these teams is currently constructed, Tulane with a win more or less can punch their ticket to the AAC championship game and secure that Army would be their opponent in this spot. How have you adjusted your power ratings up and down with a team like Navy that I don't think any of us anticipated to go into that Notre Dame game undefeated, but to Payne's point, when they stepped up in class, we saw what their limitations may be. And the flip side for a Tulane team that you can't really poke holes in their resume, losing to a team in the SEC and the Big 12, nothing to be embarrassed by, that they've more or less taken care of business when they've stepped down and played some of their conference foes.
Yeah, 2 significant upgrades. I mean, 9.5 points for Tulane. I have them inside the top 30 right now on my power rating, so they're legit. And if Boise State slips up, there's your college football playoff team out of the group of 5. Navy also 9 points upgrade. I mean, I thought it was questionable whether or not Navy would make a bowl game, let alone be sitting here. So, the only teams I've upgraded further in college football are your more obvious ones: Indiana, Vanderbilt, BYU, and Army, and Tulane and Navy are right behind those teams.
Pretty impressive company to keep, and a credit to Brian Newberry for getting this program back on track for Navy. Now, with a lot of things still in front of them, they'll have a little bit of work to do if they're going to pull off the outright upset as a full touchdown underdog. Before we go on with some of our other big game breakdowns, I want to encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, if you're not already doing so, to follow our esteemed panel on social media. You can follow Brad at BradPower7. You can follow Payne at Payne Insider, and you can follow me at Todd Fuhrman. But most importantly, as always, be sure to follow all things Bet the Board related for your NFL and college football needs at Bet the Board Pod. And BP, normally, people go, wait a second, they're talking Navy and Tulane. Either Payne got sick and Brad and Todd came up with the game breakdowns for this week, or that was going to be the non-Powers 5 contest. But we're going to dig even a little bit deeper and take us into the lovely state of Georgia, where Kennesaw State finds themselves as a 14.5-point underdog against the Sam Houston State Bearcats. And you have a unique angle on this game, given that there is a change in leadership for Kennesaw, despite the fact that this is a program that didn't have a whole hell of a lot in the way of FBS talent, who's actually been playing better ball, but apparently not enough for the administration to keep their head coach.
Yeah, we'll do old school. We'll go with the game number here, just in case you can't find it. Game number rotation, we're going with Sam Houston State's 369 here. Typically, I'm not a big guy who wants to lay 14.5 on the road with an offense that has left a lot to be desired in recent weeks. But I'll start with the Sam Houston State. Looks like the offense got some good news. Their quarterback's been banged up the last few games. Off a bye. This should be the healthiest he's been, Hunter Watson, since early October. So that's a positive there. And maybe a little bit of hidden value, the fact that he hasn't been healthy the last couple of games. But more importantly, you hit the nail on the head. Why are we laying 14.5 on the road? It's a play against the Kennesaw State team. And boy, this time of year, the power ratings shouldn't be too far off, even with games that, at this low level of FBS play. But what we're looking for is fundamental changes. And there's no more, maybe the biggest fundamental change outside of significant injury in college football this season is what just happened to Kennesaw State in the last 48 hours. They fire their coach. It's a surprise to say the least, considering they were probably playing some of their best ball in recent weeks. But Brian Bohannon's the guy's name. He's the only coach they've ever had in their history. He's the one that started it about a decade ago. Got them to, they were a perennial contender in the FCS playoffs. And then obviously transitioning this year. They just beat Liberty not a few weeks ago. It's a stunning move. And who's their interim? Well, a 28-year-old kid by the name of Chandler Burks. That's a pretty tough situation for a kid at 28 years old, to say the least. And okay, are people excited? What's the mood of the locker room? Well, the great thing about there's a lot to complain about today's day and age of college football. But the one thing you can read some tea leaves and gives you, a clear indicator is, okay, the portal's opened up now. What's happening? Well, their top defensive lineman already hit the portal within a day, so that's not good. So I just think, matchup-wise, you got a Kennesaw State offense dead last in the country in yards per play. Sam Houston State defense combined 10 points allowed the last two games. I don't like that matchup for Kennesaw, to say the least. And then we just get to the power rating. Is all this priced in? No, just not even factoring in, taking the defensive lineman out, taking the head coach out, maybe some locker room issues. What do I make it? Well, 14.7. But then you start adding in the possibility that this is a significant issue. And I think there's some value here, even though it's moved a little bit. Sam Houston State minus 14.5 for me.
Any speculation as to why Kennesaw would make this move? Do we think it's non-football related stuff? Because to your point, this is a program that had played its best football of late, and you figured the trajectory was where you'd want to be as more or less a transitional program, making the very difficult jump from the FCS to the FBS. That's
a good question. Normally, if there's some off the field maybe things, you're pretty quiet if you're the fired head coach. He hasn't been quiet. He's been all over Twitter saying, I haven't resigned, I was fired, type of thing. So makes me think that maybe we got an AD there that has some incompetency.
Payne, would you like to add a little nugget to the showdown between the Bearcats and Owls, two fine members of the animal kingdom?
Typically not a neighborhood that I drive through, but Brad made some compelling points, so I'm probably going to have a few pesos on this thing.
All right, there we go. Kennesaw State and Sam Houston. Don't ever let anyone listening to this show tell them that Brad doesn't dig deep to try and find some of the uncovered gems in these conferences. And keep in mind, Sam Houston, with a little bit of help, can still get to the Conference USA Championship game and have a chance to do something pretty improbable under Coach Keeler, given what we saw from them last year. So a very impressive turnaround down there for the Bearcats. The game that everybody will have their eyes on Saturday night in prime time from Athens, Georgia, a de facto elimination game, at least on the surface, for the Georgia Bulldogs, who came into this year as massive favorites to make the college football playoff. They are rather large favorites playing host to the Tennessee Volunteers. Georgia, a 10-point chalk in this matchup, total 48.5 the way things stand right now. Georgia, they've won 7 straight meetings versus the Vols, each of them by 14-plus points, including last year a 38-10 drubbing in Knoxville, where we saw Georgia in a very similar price range. A couple of years ago, Georgia took care of business in Athens, winning 27-13 as a 9.5-point favorite. The win last year was an important watershed moment for Tennessee. Since then, the Vols have gone 10-1 as a program and not allowed more than 25 points in a single game. As far as Tennessee so far this season, they've won 8+ games for the third straight season. For the first time since the early 2000s, the Vols can become the first team to defeat Alabama and Georgia in the same season since LSU did it in 2019. What was important about that LSU team? Plenty of NFL players went on to win the national championship, and they're looking to accomplish that feat for the first time as a program themselves since 2006. Workman-like effort for the Vols last week, 33-14 against Mississippi State, 100-yard rusher and 100-yard receiver in the same game for the 8th time under head coach Josh Heupel. 0 sacks allowed for the second time this season after allowing multiple sacks in each of the previous 5 games. Georgia on the flip side, well, we all saw what befell them in Oxford. Lost to Ole Miss, snapping a 52-game winning streak versus non-Alabama teams. The first loss versus a non-Alabama team since 2020 when Georgia lost to number 8 Florida. It tied for the fewest points in a game with 10 under Kirby Smart, fewest total yards at 245 in a game since 2017 at number 10 Auburn. The only points for Georgia came on the opening drive of each half. They'd scored 30 plus in each of their previous 5 games, and more importantly for Georgia along the offensive line, allowed a season high 5 sacks, coming into the game having allowed 10 sacks in total prior to that. I mean, this is a Georgia group right now that's a little beaten and battered. There are no players on Georgia's roster who are active during its last home loss in 2019, so there's no doubt this will be a seminal discussion point for Georgia coming into a game of this magnitude. But Brad, quite frankly, there's no way to sugarcoat it. The Georgia offense hasn't looked right for quite some time. Carson Beck struggling mightily with turnovers. The running back room is beaten and besieged by injuries. They had just 4 scholarship wide receivers available against Ole Miss. And here comes a Tennessee defense whose talent and depth along the defensive line has been on full display. And even if we have questions about the secondary, can Georgia do enough in the trenches to keep their quarterback upright to allow him to hunt the explosives against an untested Vol secondary?
Yeah, I hate to rely on recency bias, but man, from what I just saw last week, I don't have much faith that Carson Beck's going to have a clean jersey at the end of this one on Saturday night, considering Tennessee's defensive front. Maybe not as good as Ole Miss, but certainly, top 5 in the country with waves of player, both on the interior and at the pass rush. I got to start with Georgia's offense, though. You hit the nail on the head on a lot of it. Disappointing to say the least. Yards per play, 48th. 50th in total offense, 48th in scoring, 29th, a little bit the more advanced metrics, painted a little bit different picture because they have Georgia has faced the toughest schedule in the country so far. So offensive success rate, when schedule adjusts is 29th, but still unacceptable is what the word I would use. I mean, for a roster that has had 8 straight top 4 recruiting classes, I don't see this elite skill position talent. Etienne's a fine player, a Florida transfer. He's number 15th in weighted EPA. But, the other back that they've had to rely on is Nate Frazier. They don't have really anybody else because, like you mentioned, injuries. I look at more the receiver and tight end room. Arian Smith, Dominic Lovett, Dylan Bell, Lawson Lucky. Fine players, but nobody that I would, be confused with as a first team or second team all SEC player. Cass Jones, basically a former walk-on, had the longest reception last week. Then you look at Dylan Bell, basically, a tight end and a wide receiver and a tight end body had the longest rush. I don't see the elite talent there, and I know they're banged up, but come on, nobody's feeling sorry for that room as far as the talent aspect goes. Mike Bobo, it's clear as day, is a clear downgrade from Todd Monken now that we're a season and a half into him. Carson Beck, since the Kentucky game, 10 touchdown passes, 12 interceptions. At one point you're thinking he's the number 1 pick in the draft, and now does he get benched if he continues this? I think that's a legitimate question. We haven't seen anything from the Georgia run game. They've been more pass happy than recent memory. They haven't been able to run, a lot of it injury. They've been banged up front as well. Number 68 run blocking grade. You mentioned couldn't protect Carson Beck last week, allowed 5 sacks. I think a big thing is, staying ahead of the chains, because Georgia's not great at it. They're 46th in early downs EPA. Tennessee's defense, 2 in that category on defense. They cannot be in third and long that allows the guys like James Pierce to get after Carson Beck. Ratledge tried to give it a go last week, played a little bit, but then didn't finish. We'll see if he's can give it a better go on maybe a drier surface and playing surface this week. Tennessee defensively, obviously the full season counting stats are there because they're number 3 in yards per play, number 5 in yards per game, number 5 in scoring. Defense was certainly dominant at the start of the season. They only allowed 51 rushing yards per game the first 4 games. Since then, it hasn't been as buttoned up. I mean, last 2 games have been by far their 2 worst rush defensive performances of the season. Still with that in mind, they're number 1 in defensive success rate. They're number 1 in EPA per rush. I really liked what I saw from Alabama in that performance. But again, similar to Texas defensively, who has Tennessee faced defensively? I would say the next best is Arkansas. Obviously, they lost that game. They watched Arkansas's backups go right down the field and get the game-winning drive in the fourth quarter with the backup quarterback and a backup running back. So again, I know they're good, but are they elite? Are they great? Seems to be a question we ask about a lot of these teams at the top of college football in the last 2 years. I'm punching. If it sounds like I'm hard grader, I guess I'm comparing them to recent quote unquote national title contenders, and I just don't see it. What I am seeing on Tennessee is a banged up defense. Peely out for the season a couple games ago. He was their emotional leader. We never thought that the secondary was good at any point in the season. And they're relying on a true freshman to be their best player at cornerback in Boot Carter, who did do well last week, but we'll see if Georgia can maybe attack him a little bit. I think Tennessee's defensive front obviously has, the advantage up front, but other than that, it's kind of a meh. I certainly don't see Georgia going up and down the field because they haven't done that on anybody this year. But then again, I don't see, Tennessee, having enough success that overcomes maybe the significant issues that they have on the other side of the ball.
Some interesting comments in the wake of that performance, Brad, from Kirby Smart and some of the members of the Georgia offensive line. I mean, Kirby, of course, is going to come out and state his confidence, but rather than paraphrase, I'll quote him directly. He goes, "I'm completely confident in our offensive line. I think our offensive line, it's a good offensive line, but we can't put them in harm's way. When you play on the road, guys, there's not a guy in that room that's lined up at left tackle with 80,000 people screaming at you at the top of your lungs, and he, the rusher, knows it's a pass. He gets a distinct half-second advantage. Trust me, I know from coaching in this league, it's hard to do. You have to find ways to help people. You've got to be able to run the ball and slow it down, and you've got to help the backs out." And then you get Dylan Fairchild along that offensive line saying, "I think all of us wish we could go back and do at least one thing differently. I think that's just a human thought when you have a loss. I would just say the urgency is spiked in practice. It's spiked in the preparation and, all things that we can do to try and win." So you have to imagine Georgia in this spot going to do everything they can to commit to running the football, even if it's not the most efficient way to move it against this Tennessee front. Now, Payne on the other side, for Tennessee offensively, look, this is a group that I think a lot of people believed coming into the year was going to be capable of putting the big plays together. We knew Nico got some of the Heisman hype, and the talk was that he was going to be the heir apparent, not to Joe Milton, but to what we saw when Hendon Hooker was able to spread it around and Tennessee could drop 40 at a moment's notice on all of their opponents. But we can't sugarcoat what we've seen at the quarterback position. It's been about the ground game, and Dylan Sampson, no doubt, is the team's MVP. Versus Mississippi State, carried the ball 30 times for nearly 150 yards and did so on a bum ankle in the second half. 20 rushing touchdowns this season, leads the SEC. But let's not bury the lead here. All the speculation leading up to the game is the availability of Nico, and will he be out there under center, or will it be a Gaston Moore game as Nico goes through the concussion protocol of sorts? But Tennessee offensively against a Georgia defense that hasn't looked nearly as dynamic as some of the units we've seen in the past, but on their best days, we saw them raise their level of play, most notably that Saturday night in Austin when they upset the Texas Longhorns.
Certainly, Georgia has a gear, right? When everything is going well that most of the other teams can't reach. It just hasn't played to that level consistently. The reports on Nico are pretty wide ranging. We know he's in the concussion protocol, dressed and practiced lightly on Tuesday. Shannon Terry came out emphatically and said, hey, he's playing. And then we had friend of the show, Chris Felica, do the on-3 hit with the Georgia site Tuesday and He claimed his sources didn't believe Nico would play after suffering a bad concussion, and that going this route forces Kirby to prepare for 2 quarterbacks and keeps the playoff committee ranking Tennessee as best as possible, right? So there's some speculation here. We'll see what unfolds. I'm not sure I see a path for Tennessee's offense to have success either way. If it's Nico, he really hasn't shown the ability at this specific stage to run an offense like we saw Jackson Dart and Lane Kiffin do last week. Lane, I thought, had a pretty masterful game plan, helped his offensive line by getting the ball out of Jackson Dart's hands quickly in anticipation. Kirby may go with that Texas game plan again. Nico has shown a tendency to hold the ball too long. And if you look at Nico specifically, Josh Heupel has really had to aid Nico for him to be competent, has him throwing with play action on 61% of dropbacks. Nico really struggles under pressure, 4% turnover worthy play rate, 0. Big time throw rate. Accuracy falls off a cliff. Now, if he does play, right, he's coming off a concussion. It's in Athens at night. Arkansas gave Nico trouble in a similar situation. This is clearly a better Georgia defense that seems quite hungry. There was some conversations about Nico not coming out for the second half of the game last week because basically Tennessee runs a nightclub for some of its games, and the lights and the sound was getting to them. So if I'm Georgia, lights are going to be going off. There's going to be loud music playing if Nico's out there. Any edge you can get. The Vols, to me, continue just to be clunky on offense, and I thought last week was the get right tune-up game ahead of Georgia against a Mississippi State defense that's arguably the worst at the P4 level. Mississippi State is legitimately outside the top 125 in virtually every schedule-adjusted meaningful metric, and the Vols gained 60% of the available yards. That was it. And if you remove the 4th and 6 40-plus yard explosive touchdown to Squirrel, you're more so looking at about the 50% range, which is unacceptable against that version of an SEC defense. You mentioned Dylan Sampson, Todd. Tennessee's got to do a decent job finding its run game. Sampson's the leading rusher in the SEC, but he just hasn't been the most efficient rushing back in the league outside, the top 40 as a team in success rate and EPA per rush. Sampson's dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury. We've seen the fumbling woes, a fumble in each of the last 3 games. So, if Tennessee can't run it, then Kirby can fire up some of the exotic pressures and stunts in these known passing situations. And that's where the Vols offensive line has been a little bit of a sieve. Nico's been a little bit of a deer in headlights. So that combination really hasn't shown an ability in some of these known passing situations. Tennessee's outside the top 100 in passing down sack rate allowed. Going back to Brad's point, I know Georgia's offensive line and running back group are dealing and battling with some injuries here. But Kirby Smart's defense is starting to get a little healthier. Mondon returned against Ole Miss. Michael Williams has 3 straight games of 35-plus snaps. Jordan Hall even returned against Ole Miss, only had 5 snaps, but he's ramping himself back up. There's a report that Georgia's Bloody Tuesday practice was really, really good. Guys were flying around. Fantastic effort and energy. The players know this is a make-or-break game. It's at home under the lights. I don't see the Vols offense doing much of anything here.
BP, final word to you on this game in terms of how you've evaluated Georgia throughout the season with the ups and downs, some of the injuries. Have you had to make comprehensive adjustments to their power ratings throughout the course of the season? And the same, I guess, sentiment for the Vols, because I know a lot of people look at this number on the surface and go, man, this feels like a big number for Georgia to be laying, but I think they've said that each of the last 2 years, and Georgia has exceeded odds makers' expectations in this very same price range, both on the road at Neyland Stadium last year and in Athens the season before, where it was their defense that suffocated Tennessee's offense.
Clear downgrade at 5 points since the start of the season for Georgia. There was still a while there where I still had him number 1, but I I've seen too much bad to not, drop them a little bit here. And I know that they've risen up in two of their more important games against Clemson and Texas and dominated against the spread. But that's it. That's their only two covers of the season. So obviously the spread is, expectation coming in the game. And when you're consistently underperforming, I mean, you got to get a little bit aggressive with your downgrade.
That's what's making this so difficult. Because you have a Georgia team that you can see clearly with your eyes that is not what we've grown accustomed to the last few years. At the same time, the rest of college football is so down that when Georgia goes out and plays to its ceiling, you can go into Texas and curb stomp them by multiple scores. And so, God forbid, Georgia has another loss. I don't want to be a committee member because they probably have two of the best wins. Beating a Clemson team on a neutral by 4 scores, going into Texas, beating them by multiple scores. And meanwhile, you're looking at like Penn State ranked 4th, who is doesn't have one quality win. And, you're struggling to beat USC in overtime, who just benched its quarterback and, is fighting for bowl eligibility. So it's very difficult to assess what's currently going on in the college football landscape, specifically with Georgia here.
Brad, the final thing, and we'll close the book on this game. You mentioned Georgia and some of their struggles at the window. Tennessee hasn't exactly been better. These two teams have combined 3-10 against the number in conference games this season. So clearly two commodities that have been overvalued by bettors, and we'll see where rubber meets the road this Saturday night in Athens. Final game, gents, on the docket for us this fine week. Another Big 12 game, and it's Arizona State at Kansas State, another program that I didn't expect we'd be talking about deep into the month of November. But Kenny Dillingham deserves a world of credit for what he's been able to accomplish. Kansas State, fresh off a bye, 9.5-point favorites as they'll welcome in the Sun Devils. Total on the game, 50. Kenny D, in my opinion, would get Coach of the Year consideration and still very well might in a normal season for what he's been able to do. 7-2, the best 9-game start for the Sun Devils since 2014. 2 road wins for the program this year after having 2 road wins in the previous 2 seasons combined. And if you want to feel old, guys, this is the nugget to do so. Kenny Dillingham will become the first head coach born in the 1990s as a head coach in a bowl game, born on April 28th, 1990. It makes us all feel a little bit older with that nugget there. Injuries, of course, important to monitor. Cam Scadaboo for Arizona State. There sounded like there was a little bit more optimism in his availability after he sat out last weekend's win against UCF. And Kenny Dillingham, if his career fails as a head coach, which you don't think it will, maybe he'll get into odds making. We've got to play with a chip on our shoulder next week at Kansas State in the wake of their win against UCF, because we're probably going to be a 7.5 to 14-point dog on the road at night in Manhattan, where it's going to be 35 degrees. Kenny was ballpark directionally correct on the number, not so much on his weather forecast. I don't think it'll be nearly as cold as anticipated. Kansas State, meanwhile, though, they come in a little bit more well-rested, and this is a program that knew they were going to have a late bye. They said during the summer months, they tried to map out what they wanted to do with this particular bye week, and that was getting some of the younger players a lot more reps. I don't think Coach Kleiman expected to come into the bye, though, fresh off a loss against the Houston Cougars as nearly a 2-touchdown favorite, a game they led 19-10 going into the fourth quarter, and they had won 28 straight games as a program when leading by 9+ points entering the fourth, much to our chagrin. Their lowest output in rushing yards and total yards put us in a little bit of peril with that Cougars win total.
Oh, my God.
For Kansas State, 1-5-1 against the number versus 8 unranked teams this season, 2-0 when they step up in class and take on ranked foes. But Brad, Arizona State offensively, hard to do an effective handicap when we don't know the status of Cam Scadaboo, but Sam Leavitt provided nice stability at the quarterback position as a game manager. The redshirt freshman has thrown for more than 1,600 yards and 14 touchdowns to just 4 picks, developed quite the rapport with Jordan Tyson, who's become a star in the passing game. Against the Kansas State defense, that's been good against the run, relatively speaking. Leaves a lot to be desired in the passing attack. But if it's strength on strength and weakness on weakness, how do we go about identifying an edge here?
Well, let's not bury the lead. Cam Scadaboo is one of the more valuable non-quarterbacks, in my opinion, in the entire country. Just basic the fact that you look at his usage rates. But I can tell you this. I think he's worth more than 1. I'm not going to be some podcast that say, well, my projections say that if he's 60%, he'll be worth 2.3 points. I won't go into that detail, but he's, in my opinion, he's greater than 1 point. Is as much as 3? Man, I won't go that far, but we are talking about a guy in Scadaboo that touched the football the first 8 games of the season 25 times a game combined as far as 200 rushing attempts and receptions. He's their second leading receiver. So you look at what happened with Arizona State last week without him. Maybe if you're just looking at the scoreboard, they scored 35 points. They were fine. No, they weren't fine. It was the worst offensive performance of the season. They only had 260 yards. Hadn't had a game all season below 343. Misleading 35 points were scored because they scored 2 non-offensive touchdowns. Block punt return touchdown and a short pick 6 after a dumb thing by a UCF player. Who would have thought that? But the 3.1 yards per carry was a season low, so they clearly missed him. Now, Leavitt, had a really good game last week and had to for them to come out with the victory. You mentioned Jordan Tyson. He's really developed a good relationship with him. He's led the way there at the wide receiver game. So to me, when you look at the full season stats, they have leaned on the ground game. 21st in EPA per rush, 13th in rush success rate. So Scadaboo's good to go, and I concur. It seemed like it was a little more optimistic from Tuesday's report compared to what we were, 24 hours earlier. Although I do find it interesting, market says different because we're out to 10 at a few spots that take bigger bets here in Vegas. So that would be my concern there. Kansas State defensively, their weakness is more in the pass game. So we'll see if if a one-dimensional, if they don't have Scadaboo, obviously Arizona State's a little bit more one-dimensional. We'll see if a one-dimensional Arizona State passing attack can get after Kansas State's pass defense. That's had 3 different games where they allowed nearly 350 yards. But you had to bring up the Houston game. That threw me. I was trying to forget about that one. That one hurt badly. Kansas State, number 4 in defensive success rate, number 2 rush success rate. So they have some bits and pieces that are there, particularly Mott Kid off the edge can get after the quarterback. I like Romaine at linebacker, tackling machine for them. But this, to me, still isn't one of those, I guess I'm aging myself, but doesn't feel like one of those great Bill Snyder type defenses. They do little things well, but if you told me Scadaboo was playing, I think Arizona State would have some success here.
Definitely a path to get their bell cow back involved and catching this kind of number with a total that sits right around 50. You can see the path and the blueprint being laid out for Arizona State. So an injury, no doubt, that everyone getting involved in this game will continue to monitor. Payne on the other side, Kansas State, Avery Johnson, 23 of 39, 238 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 picks. The 2 picks tied a career high for him in that loss against Houston. 9-2 in his career as a starting quarterback. What's interesting when you assess Kansas State right now to where they were early in the season, it appears to me that they're at least making a concerted effort to turn him into more of a pocket passer. I mean, the rushing yards haven't been there, the willingness to run to a lesser extent. And on some level, it's taken away one of the key components that made this Kansas State offense more difficult to defend early in the season. And it wasn't lost on the Wildcats coaching staff, who said their running game has been sputtering as a result over the last 3 games. And you see that in DJ Giddens' production. 17 carries, a season low 50 yards against Houston, a pair of sub-60-yard rushing games in 2 out of the last 3. They do have a dynamic playmaker in the receiving room in Jace Brown, who more or less is a one-man show. Keegan Johnson, I guess, is a Robin to Jace Brown being Batman for what they want to do. And here's an Arizona State defense that has struggled immensely to get after opposing quarterbacks. They don't generate a ton of pressure, but this is a group that's got a couple difference makers, and the one thing they do, they fly around, they play downhill, and it's not for a lack of energy or intensity that slow down the Sun Devils, despite giving up a crooked number last week and yards in chunks against Dylan Rizek in that UCF offense.
So you've kind of led me 1,000 different directions here, and my mind's kind of going in all of them. Specific to Avery Johnson and Kansas State, they have a long-term plan for him. They are cognizant he's able to move the ball with his legs, and so they've kind of gone with this effort of not necessarily turning him into a pocket passer, but having him improve that portion of his game for years down the line. I think there's also if you've read the tea leaves, he's been battling through some things, and that's partly why he hasn't been running as much. But listening to Chris Kleinman's presser Tuesday, it sounds like the bye week came at the perfect time, to Brad's point a little bit earlier in the show, the classic coach speak there. But Kansas State had guys banged up. This week, everyone that's not out for the season has practiced to this point in the week. So we should see a healthier O-line, should see a little bit healthier of a pass-catching group. It was a much-needed week off for Avery Johnson, so maybe his mobility is a little bit more present. And in a spot like this, all the team's goals are still in front of them. It sounds like a positive K-State group, despite blowing the 2-score lead at Houston. Matchup-wise, I think Kansas should be able to find some success on the ground if they can get back to their prior early down form. Giddens, Edwards, and Johnson using his mobility a little bit more as a nice little three-headed rushing attack. The Cats' offensive line had made some strides before the injuries, despite a lot of the turnover that group faced coming into the season. This is still a K-State offense that's been good down to down as a whole, with a 48% rushing success rate. Almost 22% of runs between Giddens, Edwards, and Johnson have gone 10-plus yards, so it's an extremely explosive run game for K-State. The bye week also came at an interesting time scheme-wise. Kleinman talked about Arizona State's defensive front, how it's one of the few 4-down defensive fronts in the Big 12, and how you have to change some of the ways you block it up relative to all of the 3-down fronts you see throughout the conference. So having 2 weeks to prepare for that sounds like a positive. Arizona's defense, to your point, tries to get downhill. It's not always successful doing it. Yeah, they don't create a ton of havoc or tackles for loss, but you can wear on them a little bit, like we saw with R.J. Harvey and Miles Montgomery a week ago. They went for 5.6 yards a carry combined. To me, it also feels like there's some meat on the bone for Avery Johnson and his receivers. Right now, around 50th in passing success rate and EPA per pass. Arizona State really tries to prevent the explosive, but they give up some yards in front through the air. So I look at Avery Johnson. When he's been kept clean, he's been a solid passer. But in those situations, his receivers have a 12% drop rate, which is a massive, massive number. But this is, to me, as an Arizona State secondary outside our top 75 in passing success rate allowed. They let a 3-star redshirt freshman, Dylan Risk, making his first road start, register a 52% success rate through the air. So I think K-State has an opportunity here now that they're touch healthier to find some success on offense. In terms of the big question mark, Cam Scatterbo, there's video, so I feel a little bit more comfortable talking about this. There's video out there last week of him going up to Kenny in the third quarter, seeing how tragic the offense was. And
they mentioned this in the articles. It's pretty funny.
And saying that, I put me in here, coach, I got to go. And Kenny was kind of trying to dismiss it. So that kind of lends itself to him. Like, he's a tough guy. I don't know if he'll be 100%. It kind of lends itself to him maybe being out there, unless the coach is just going to be super protective of Scatterbo. So we'll see how that plays out, but we'll certainly have more information on that situation later in the week.
Yeah, pair of 4-2 teams. Kansas State going to need a little bit of help if they're going to get themselves to the Big 12 championship game. But the only way thing that they can control is winning their remaining 3 football games to try and put themselves in a position should BYU and Colorado falter down the stretch. You can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well. Follow me on social, but most importantly, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod for all of your NFL and college football needs. Best bet portion of the program, ladies and gentlemen. I know we kicked around a number of possibilities, Payne, before the show started. The floor is yours, kind sir.
I would have liked this at a little bit of a different number, better. I still like it where we currently are. There were some 3.5 in market early this morning that started to get a little bit wiped out. We're just kind of in like no man's land in the market. I think we've talked about this all the time. So
these Wednesdays suck, as BP has said.
Not sure where this trends from here, and certainly it being the last game of the evening, there's going to be some I think, the casual sentiment towards the undefeated BYU team here. But let's go with 363 Kansas. We'll call it +3 for the show. I mean, I think if you're a bettor who likes to kind of keep by the screen, the next move won't necessarily, I don't think, take it off the 3. And there's some potential to maybe wait this one out and see if some hooks pop up again. You know, our prior sponsor had 3.5 this morning. That looks like it's been mostly wiped out. But 363 Kansas, if you want to talk about it, maybe from a matchup perspective, go for it.
Yeah, there is some 3.5 -20 if our listeners kind of want to shop around or have available on the cheap buy. Again, a total of 55.5, probably not the best from a math standpoint to try and do so there. But BYU, look, I mean, Brad has brought this to our attention a number of times so far this season. If you flip one data point, how much different does a number get for a particular game? And in this case, how much different does this game look if BYU doesn't get the holding penalty called against Utah on 4th down last week in Salt Lake City? Credit to BYU for erasing a 21-10 halftime deficit, but there was a very real possibility that they lose that game outright against the Utes, get knocked from the ranks of the unbeaten, and suddenly are trying to wipe themselves up off the deck to try and rally in this spot. Meanwhile, on the other side, you can make a legitimate case that this Kansas Jayhawks team is amongst the unluckiest in all of college football, given what they've gone through. You go through their resume, and yes, from a win-loss standpoint, it's just 3-6, but against Kansas State, lose by 2 points, had a chance to win that game. Against Arizona State, late in that contest, they come up 4 points short, had a chance to win that football game as well. West Virginia, they're leading with a weather delay in early September. They come up 4 points short on the road in Morgantown. And against UNLV, I don't know what the hell happened in that second half. But here comes a Kansas team, a veteran-laden group 3-6 that has to win out to get bowl eligible. And while, yes, they can't win a conference championship, they can sure as hell throw a wrench into a lot of what the college football landscape will look like if you can upset BYU this week and take care of business against Colorado in a nationally televised game next week. But most notably for me, what stood out coming out of the bye against Kansas State was what we saw from their veteran quarterback in Jalen Daniels. He looked as healthy as we've seen him look in playing pitch and catch against Iowa State. Now, the numbers don't blow you away, 12 for 24 from a completion standpoint, but the big play was there from a rating standpoint, and a QBR, arguably his best, and he followed that up. I mean, he had a strong quarterback rating against Houston as well a couple weeks prior, and this looks like a Kansas team that's starting to play its best ball. The only reservation is, look, we've talked at great lengths how Provo has been a house of horrors. It's one of the more difficult and underrated home field advantages, but I get the feeling we're starting to see kinks in the armor for BYU, playing tight, playing with pressure, and this is a Kansas team that can go loose and free. Not only do I think the Jayhawks cover this number, I think they go into Provo and knock off BYU in a late night game. So Kansas plus the points. I don't think we'll need them. I think they win the game outright.
Certainly a large schedule discrepancy as well. Kansas has faced one of the tougher schedules in the Big 12. BYU, these are starting to get to be the spots where it's unfamiliar territory, right? There's a lot of pressure on these guys now. So all of the data points prior, you're playing fast, free, and loose. To me, these are the games that are a little bit more make and break. And so when teams aren't traditionally in these spots, there's that possibility of folding in these unfamiliar high leverage games.
One thing I will say, if anything else, Jake Retzlaff has been consistent as BYU starting quarterback, and kind of digging into this, apropos of absolutely nothing. His stat line over the last 5 games is eerily similar to one another. He's thrown for 218 yards in 3 of the last 5 games, exactly 218 yards, threw for 219 yards last week against Utah, and 228 sandwiched in there against UCF. So kind of doesn't matter who BYU plays. We know where Retzlaff will be, and for over-under for passing yards, I wonder if that makes it considerably easier for odds makers to set his total. As we know, BYU wants to establish the ground game and try and take a little bit off Retzlaff's plate against a underrated secondary in Kansas that I think should have some success here. So, BP, do we get the Powers stamp of approval on the Jayhawks plus the points in Provo?
Absolutely. Big time rubber stamp of approval. It's in the portfolio. It's been given out. I concur with the outright too.
Like it. Like when we are all in lockstep, gentlemen. Before we close up shop, anything else that you guys would like to share? Any things that you're looking for this weekend or any other general sentiments? I was unhappy, and spoiler alert, I haven't watched the assessment you guys provided for the Yellowstone season premiere. So I'm not looking forward to going to watch that just yet. But anything else you guys wanted to share on the college football slate that we didn't touch on?
Florida State won't lose this week.
That's a positive. Well, that's not... I mean, there is a chance they could lose recruits, Payne. So let's not look a gift horse in the mouth just yet. They could lose the off-field battle instead.
That's very possible. Very possible.
But should be another fun week. The marquee matchup as we spent an inordinate amount of time on Georgia and Tennessee, but still plenty of other races, both from the conference variety and the college football playoff that'll unfold before us. So for Payne Insider, Brad Powers, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your college football Week 12 investments, and with a Sam Houston State ticket and the Kansas Jayhawks in those old portfolios, we'll see all you guys and girls at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.